part of sustaining government's response to the recommendations of the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture, President Cyril Ramaphosa chaired a meeting of the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council yesterday. The council supplements the work done by law enforcement agencies and then plays an independent role in terms of combating corruption and other criminal activities. For more on this, we're joined by Professor Firoz Cachalia, the Chair of National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. President Ramaphosa says the fight against corruption is among the foremost and perhaps the most urgent tasks at this moment in the country's history. Why now more than ever before?
Well, good evening, and good evening to your listeners. I don't think the President's characterization of the situation is exaggerated. We have a deep-rooted problem of systemic, pervasive corruption across many institutions of the state at all levels of our system of government. To deal with the multifaceted nature, the systemic nature of corruption, we as a society are going to have a determined long-term focus on institutional transformation. That is to say, strengthening existing anti-corruption institutions, particularly those in the criminal justice cluster, but also to look at where the gaps are in the system and establish new institutions which may be necessary. Our preliminary view as a council is that there are certainly gaps in the system, particularly on the preventative side. And so what we have been established to do is to provide advice to the President on the implementation of a comprehensive all-society strategy to combat corruption over the long term.
In speaking about the gaps in the system, just looking at a report from Corruption Watch, it's revealed that South Africa, of course, remains the highest highly corrupt country despite efforts by both the government and the private sector to curb this. And breaking down the enablers here, the main reports of corruption relate to maladministration at 25%, fraud at 17%, nepotism and favoritism at 13%. These are the top three that will need a really collaborated effort and solutions to counter. What are you exploring around those top three specifically?
Okay, perhaps I should discuss with you exactly, give you some sense of the scope of our work. We are acting in terms of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, which was adopted by the Cabinet 2 years ago, and we also are looking at the recommendations of the Zondo Commission, which recommended, among other things, the establishment of several new institutions, one on procurement fraud, whistleblower protection. It also recommended that a body with powers similar to its own should be established on a permanent basis. So we are looking at the system. So, for instance, that would include procurement. Clearly, our systems of government have been vulnerable to capture, vulnerable to fraud and corruption, and it falls then within the mandate of the Council to look at what steps in the nature of reform need to be taken to combat corruption and to ensure that state capture, that our system is immunized from logic of state capture.
Yeah.
So we are providing advice to the President on the implementation of the Zondo Commission recommendations. We're looking at strengthening existing institutions in the criminal justice cluster, which includes the NIA, the National Prosecuting Authority, the Hawks, the ID, and so forth. And we're also looking at whether a new institution has to be established to focus on prevention. Take, for instance, the problems that we're experiencing in ESCOM or the problems in the various hospitals in Gauteng. Clearly there what you're faced with is systemic corruption, and it's simply not sufficient for us to focus on simply on identifying culprits and prosecuting them after the fact. We have to ensure that we have institutions in place, systems in place to prevent corruption. We're looking at whistleblower protection, which is emerging as a very important area of our work. I mean, we're getting to the point where whistleblowers are being murdered, so it's a serious matter. We're looking at procurement reform, but our focus is particularly on procurement fraud. There is legislation currently before Parliament. Our mandate is to look at whether that legislation is satisfactory from a fraud prevention point of view. We're looking at systems of monitoring and evaluation, because over the long term, any effective strategy to deal with this kind of systemic corruption needs to be effectively monitored. We're looking at the way boards are appointed in the SOEs, professionalization of the public service. So what I'm trying to convey to yourself and to the listeners out there is that, starting from the observations of the President, we're dealing with a very serious matter. There is no magic bullet. There's no panacea. We're not going to crack this nut, in the next few months. What we're going to have to do is to recognize that this challenge requires a long-term commitment to institutional reform, which must include active participation by our people as part of the strategy to combat corruption over the long term.
Professor Cachalia, perhaps let me just interrupt you there. You make mention of exploring the possibility of even a new institution being brought on board. I mean, that in itself would mean more funds need to be allocated. Why not have the focus on strengthening what we have already to ensure that there is some sense of effectiveness?
That's a great question, and we must do that. So, for instance, we've been engaging with the NPA, with the Hawks, with various structures that constitute the criminal justice cluster. But remember that these institutions focus on corruption after the fact. They focus on investigating and prosecuting individual acts of corruption. Now, clearly, one of the challenges is to strengthen their capacity to achieve results. But the international experience demonstrates that you also have to have a strong focus on prevention. Procurement reform, sort of strengthening our system so that corruption can be prevented as opposed to responded to after the fact. And so, that may be one of the gaps in the system that requires serious attention. In Australia, they've just established a new institution. It took them 20 years. We don't have that kind of time, but that institution is focused on prevention of systemic corruption. And I think if there's any lesson to be learned from state capture, it is that we have to go back and think about why we were vulnerable to state capture, despite the existence of strong constitutional provisions and the various institutions in the criminal justice system that you're referring to.
Yeah.
So we need to do both. We need to strengthen the existing institutions, but also look at where the gaps are in the system and ask the question whether we need to establish new institutions as well. And as you're pointing out, that's a complex task. It's a long-term task. It will require the allocation of resources, the appropriate skills, and systems like, for instance, like forensic auditing, and so forth. Tembisa Hospital is a very good example. Mm-hmm. If we just focus on prosecution, investigation and prosecution of individual acts of corruption after the fact, it's too late, right? We've got to focus on prevention as well.
Mm. We've seen the effects of corruption across society. I mean, the deeply disturbing details in the State Capture Commission showed the extent of how corruption erodes the capability of the state. Now, when it comes to legislative reforms aimed at enriching the country's prevention of corruption, what are you putting on the table? What are some of the proposals that you'll be exploring?
Well, one of the areas we've identified, and we indicated that to the President, includes the legislation regulating the funding of political parties. We're looking at the legislation regulating procurement. It is our view that that whistleblower protection is going to require new legislation. We have established a work stream which is currently looking at where the gaps are. My own view is that it's going to have to include looking at our criminal laws to see if there are reforms that are required to support the prosecution of individuals who have been indicted. Because I think that one of the reasons why it's difficult to secure prosecutions and convictions, rather, when you're prosecuting complex crimes like money laundering, for instance, organized crime, which often now increasingly dovetails with political corruption. Often our prosecutors and investigators are hamstrung. So we need to be looking at strengthening their capacity, but also whether there are legislative changes that need to be introduced to support their efforts.
Mm. And very lastly, Professor, you say that unlike Australia, South Africa doesn't have 20 years to sort of formulate these concepts. You made mention also about the impact that you're hoping to have when it comes to the process around whistleblowers. We know that some are living, have had to flee the country. Some are not able to even access jobs. Lives are at risk. When it comes to urgency on some areas like that element of whistleblowing, is there a level of urgency around speed, perhaps? Or, I mean, you say to me that there's no magic board that there's nothing to crack this, and in the next few months it's not going to be an easy nut to crack. But are there any areas that you will look at, perhaps at a more accelerated pace?
So I think we should look at this in parallel. There are existing institutions that need to be strengthened, that need to be taking action. The SIU, the Asset Forfeiture Unit, SARS, the MPA, we've seen them over the last 2 or 3 years certainly significantly improving their capacity to act. So while we are looking at this infrastructure, the overall system, and looking at whether we need new institutions, we need to ensure that interim effective interim steps are also taken. Whistleblowing is definitely one of those areas. And there we have made interim recommendations to the President. That work stream is being led by a very dynamic, passionate leader of that, convener of that process, who's also known to most of you, Tandeka Kubula Mbeki. And that work stream has recommended the establishment of the appointment on an interim basis of a judge to consider situations where whistleblowers need protection, and so you know, while we're looking at fundamental long-term legislative reform, we have also put specific interim proposals to the presidency to be considered.
Very well. Thank you so much for your time. Let's perhaps leave it there for now. Prof.